You clicked for a math trick that saved hundreds of American P-51 Mustang bomber crews. Here it is, a refugee mathematician, a wall of bullet holes, and a conclusion so counterintuitive it changed how the Air Force's armored planes, escorted bombers, and survived the worst skies over Europe. Spring 1944. Debden, England. Ground crews chalk fresh kill marks on olive-drab Mustangs while bomber engines rumble across the field like distant thunder. The plan is simple on paper, impossible in the air. B-17S and B-24s will cross into Germany, escorted by the new long-range P-51s. Hold the line until the bombers can turn for home. Bring as many men back as possible. Captain Neil Carter zips his flight jacket and glances at his wingman. They know what shredded aluminum looks like. They have walked under returning fortresses and liberators, counting holes by the dozens, reading each tear as a near miss on a friend's life. And yet, inside a blacked-out apartment near Columbia University, a quiet man with a pipe has already seen something the front line cannot. Not the holes that exist, but the ones that do not. Abraham Wald called it the mistake of looking only at survivors. The Air Forces were ready to bolt steel onto the places that showed the most scars. Wald said no. Armor where the holes are missing. Protect what never makes it home when hit. Engines, cockpits, control lines. On the Mustangs that will guard the bomber stream, shield the fuel and the lifelines that keep them in the fight. That single shift will ripple from briefing rooms to cloud decks, from pencil marks on paper to men finding their way back to base. Escort duty was billed as the turning point of the air war. The Mustang's range meant the bombers could be protected all the way to Berlin and back. But the statistics were merciless. Before the P-51's arrival, a bomber crew's odds of surviving their 25 mission tour hovered around 30%. Even with escorts, flak and fighters ripped through the skies in streaks of fire. Pilots like Carter watched their bomber charges stagger home with holes punched through wings, tails nearly sheared off, and fuselages stitched like cloth. Some came in trailing smoke. Others didn't come at all. On bad days, a third of the formation never reappeared over the channel. The weight of absence was always heavier than the damaged planes limping in. And yet, this is where mathematics whispered a hidden truth. In August 1943, months before the Mustang first saw action in force, Abraham Wald had already sketched the logic on a chalkboard. He pointed to diagrams of bullet-riddled B-17 and B-24s. The military brass saw evidence that wings and fuselages were the most common targets. Wald shook his head. These planes survived. The planes that didn't, their holes are in the places you don't see. To the generals, it was heresy. To armor an aircraft where damage appeared least frequent felt like madness. But Wald's insight was simple and devastating. Survival created an illusion. You could study every survivor, map every hit, and still miss the truth hiding in the missing data. Survivorship bias. It was the invisible killer, one that mathematics, not intuition, could reveal. And soon, those calculations would reach beyond bombers alone. The P-51 Mustang, tasked with holding the Luftwaffe at bay, would be armored and adapted with Wald's logic. Saving bombers meant saving the escorts who shielded them. At Wright Field in Ohio, September 1943, a roomful of officers studied neat diagrams plastered across a board. Red dots scattered across the silhouettes of B-17 bombers, each one marking a bullet hole mapped from returning aircraft. The fuselage was riddled, the wings peppered, engines and cockpits, strangely, were spared. "Gentlemen, the data speaks for itself," declared Major General Oliver Eccles, chief of the Materiel Command. We reinforce the fuselage. We strengthen the wings. That is where the enemy is hitting us. His logic was straight as a ruler, armor where the holes are. But across the country, in a shuttered apartment near Columbia University, Wald stared at the same charts in silence, smoke curling from his pipe. For days he barely spoke, just traced his finger over the bullet-pocked diagrams. Finally, at a September meeting of the Statistical Research Group, he looked up and said simply, "You are all wrong. The Air Force is wrong." The room froze. Other mathematicians, bright minds who had already sketched armor placements and filled notebooks with equations, blinked at him. Wrong? The evidence was overwhelming. The fuselage took the most hits. What else could it mean? Wald stood at the blackboard and drew another bomber silhouette. He shaded the wings, the fuselage, the spots the generals had circled for armor. "These planes returned," he said. "They took damage here and survived. You armor the wrong places if you follow this pattern." Then he marked the quiet spaces, the engines, the cockpit, the delicate control cables running through the tail. The missing damage is on the missing planes. These are the shots that kill because no one brings back a bomber with its cockpit blown out. The insight dropped like a thunderclap. Wald had spotted what no general had. Survival itself was hiding the truth. When Wald presented his conclusion to Air Force representatives in September 1943, the reaction was immediate disbelief. Brigadier General Orville Anderson leaned forward across the table. "Professor Wald, you're asking us to ignore the damage we see and add armor to places that look untouched. That defies every instinct we have." Wald adjusted his glasses. "General, your instincts are based only on survivors. Survivors mislead. The planes you never see again tell the true story." He tapped the board. "Engines, cockpits, control systems. These are your fatal hits. Armor them, and your crews will live." The generals exchanged skeptical glances. Some muttered about academic theorists with no combat experience. To them, Wald's proposal sounded like a gamble. Reinforce the fuselage, you at least protect what always gets hit. Armor the engines? That meant redesign, extra weight, complications. And all for areas that seemed rarely touched. But Wald had numbers. He laid out loss reports from Schweinfurt and Regensburg, catastrophic raids where dozens of bombers went down. Witnesses reported engines exploding mid-air, cockpits shredded by cannon fire. He matched the testimony against the so-called empty data. "Your own evidence proves it," Wald said. "The missing holes mark the missing planes." Still, the debate raged. Airmen like Captain Robert Morgan of the Memphis Belle balked at the idea. "We're already hauling too much weight," he argued. "Now they want to slap armor where we don't even get hit." He saw only his own luck, not the silent graveyard of crews who never limped back. By late 1943, though, desperation was rising. Bomber losses were unsustainable. And as the P-51 Mustang prepared for its first full winter of escort missions, engineers began folding Wald's logic into their calculations. If Mustangs were to shield the bomber stream, they couldn't fall prey to the same blind spots. Their vulnerable fuel tanks and engines demanded protection, exactly where Wald insisted. The stage was set for his math to leave the blackboard and enter the skies. October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday. 291 B-17S roared toward the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. They were met by the full fury of the Luftwaffe. Hundreds of fighters, walls of flak. By dusk, 77 bombers were gone. Another 60 staggered back, riddled and broken. Nearly 600 airmen never returned. Losses like these couldn't be sustained. At this rate, bomber groups would be bled dry before spring. For General Hap Arnold, The message was clear. Instinct and tradition had failed. The Air Force needed cold mathematics, walls. Orders went out within days. Armor kits were drawn up, steel plating wrapped around engines, bulletproof glass shielding cockpits, reinforced conduits protecting control cables. At modification depots across England, mechanics worked through the night, bolting armor where, to the naked eye, none was needed. The first modified bombers flew combat in November. Crews braced for disappointment, convinced the extra weight would drag them down. But then something strange happened. Losses fell. Missions deep into Germany that should have bled squadrons dry saw far more planes making it home. Armor in the empty zones was saving lives. And the logic didn't stop with the heavy bombers. As the P-51 Mustang rolled out in greater numbers, engineers faced the same puzzle: how to protect an aircraft without strangling its speed and range. Wald's principle gave the answer: the Mustang's long, thin fuel tanks, its liquid-cooled Merlin engine, prime targets. Protect them, and pilots had a fighting chance. For the first time, escort fighters weren't just fast and lethal. They were survivable. A math trick born from unseen bullet holes was about to change the balance of the air war. December 1943. The 8th Air Force braced itself for yet another push deep into the Reich. But this time, the bombers weren't going alone. Fresh squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, fitted with drop tanks for range and armor where Wald's logic dictated, rose alongside them. Captain Neil Carter scanned his gauges as his squadron formed up above the lumbering bomber stream. Below, the silver B-17s droned eastward, their crews trusting him and his men to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. It was trust built on desperation. Every gunner knew the odds. The first German fighters came in hard, diving from the sun. Me-109S and FW-190S clawed for the bombers' engines, their cannon fire flashing across formation after formation. Carter shoved his Mustang into a climb, lining up a shot. The duel was vicious, tracers stitching the air. What Carter couldn't see from his cockpit was that far below the bombers were enduring differently than before. Flak bursts still tore holes in fuselages. Fighter fire still raked wings. But hits that once meant fiery deaths, engine strikes, cockpit penetrations, were stopped cold by the armor Wald had insisted on. Crews who would have gone down in flames now limped home, shaken but alive. Loss reports told the story in numbers. In August, before modifications, losses had spiked near 10% per mission. By December, with armor shifted to the empty zones, that figure had fallen to just over 3%, even as missions pushed deeper into Germany than ever. For the Mustang pilots, the effect was immediate. Instead of watching bomber formations disintegrate mid-mission, they found themselves escorting more aircraft home. The bombers still bled, but now they bled slower. Wald's invisible math was making itself visible in aluminum and survival. By early 1944, word had spread through bomber groups like wildfire. Something had changed. Crews staggered back from missions with tales of near misses that weren't fatal anymore. Staff Sergeant James Hensley, a ball turret gunner with the 381 bomb group, told it straight after a Berlin raid. A jagged flak fragment had punched through the belly of his B-17 and slammed against a new plate of armor welded just behind his head. Before, that would have been the end of me, he said, climbing out with nothing worse than ringing ears. Technical Sergeant Roy Vasquez, a flight engineer with the 91st, swore his crew owed their lives to the armor that now cocooned the fuel lines. Lost number 2 engine to flak over Frankfurt, he explained, and usually that means fire, bailout, and goodbye. But this time, no flames. We made it home on 3 engines. The modification program wasn't perfect. Pilots grumbled about sluggish climbs, longer takeoff runs, and the nagging sense that extra pounds slowed them down. Yet, even the skeptics quieted when survival rates began to climb. As one pilot put it, "I'll take a heavier bird over a coffin any day." For the Mustang squadrons weaving above the bomber stream, Wald's logic was just as critical. Their engines, fragile and liquid-cooled, had been magnets for enemy fire. Armor in just the right places turned a fatal hit into a manageable wound. Pilots who once ditched over German fields now coaxed battered Mustangs back across the Channel. And in the ready rooms, the change wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Crews who had once felt like gamblers rolling dice with death began to believe they had a fighting chance. Morale, that most invisible of armors, was hardening too. By spring 1944, Wald's once controversial recommendations had hardened into standard practice. Every new bomber arriving in England carried the armor plates in precisely the spots he'd identified. Cockpits reinforced, engines shielded, control cables wrapped. And for the Mustang, the logic was the same: armor the lifelines, not the scars. The results were undeniable. Mission after mission, deep strikes into the Reich that once spelled certain massacre were now survivable. The loss rate per sortie dropped steadily. Bomber groups battered at Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin began returning with enough strength to fly again the next day. For the first time, the numbers favored the Americans, and above the bomber stream, the Mustangs were rewriting the air war. German fighter pilots had once called the B-17 a flying pincushion, easy to shred with cannon fire aimed at engines and cockpits. Now they found their prey unnervingly durable. Hits that should have ripped open fuel tanks sputtered against armor. Cockpit glass shattered but did not yield. Engines coughed and kept running. General Adolf Galland of the Luftwaffe admitted as much in his memoirs. The Americans suddenly became harder to kill. Our pilots reported that shots which destroyed bombers 6 months ago no longer brought them down. We suspected armor improvements, but not the systematic genius behind them. For Mustang pilots like Neil Carter, this meant fewer bombers vanishing in fireballs beneath his wings. Escorts were still brutal work. Dogfights tore squadrons apart, but each time he led his formation home with more bombers intact, Wald's invisible hand was at work. The shift was clear. American air power was no longer bleeding out. It was gathering strength, fueled by math that saw what human eyes had missed. Survivorship bias had become not just a theory, but a weapon. February 1944. The 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, the Big Week. Day after day, waves of bombers and escorts struck German aircraft factories, testing whether daylight bombing could truly break the Reich's industrial backbone. Losses had been crippling in the past. Now the difference was stark. The Mustangs swept ahead, tangling with the Luftwaffe in savage dogfights. For every German fighter that slipped through, dozens were driven off or destroyed. Carter and his men learned to dive straight into enemy formations, scattering attacks before they reached the bombers. The trick, Carter later recalled, wasn't just to kill them. It was to keep them from aiming at the bombers at all. Still, hits landed. Flak tore through formations. Cannon fire lanced across the sky. But Wald's armor meant something crucial. Bombers that should have fallen stayed in the fight. Engines absorbed punishment without igniting. Cockpits withstood glancing blows. Control cables kept working even after being chewed by shrapnel. General Jimmy Doolittle, newly in command of the 8th Air Force, studied the loss charts with a strategist's eye. Missions deeper into Germany now returned with acceptable losses, 2, maybe 3%. A year earlier, the same raids would have meant 10% gone, sometimes more. Without Wald's work, Doolittle wrote later, we would have had to pause, rebuild, retrain. His math gave us the ability to keep striking without breaking. For German defenders, the shift was devastating. Fighter pilots pressed attacks only to watch Mustangs snap onto their tails. Those who fought through found bombers that simply refused to die. Galland described it bitterly. The fortresses had become flying tanks. The big week broke the back of the Luftwaffe. Factories burned, fighters were lost faster than they could be replaced, and for the first time the daylight offensive looked not suicidal, but sustainable. The war in the air was tipping. By June 1944, the war in the air looked nothing like it had just a year earlier. Back then, unescorted bombers had been slaughtered over Regensburg and Schweinfurt, their crews facing coin-flip odds of survival. Now, with Wald's armor logic baked into every fortress and liberator, and with Mustangs stretching their reach across Germany, the calculus had flipped. On the morning of June 6th, D-Day, more than 11,000 sorties thundered across the English Channel. Bombers draped the invasion beaches in smoke and fire, while Mustangs clawed at the skies above. Losses were inevitable, but manageable. Just 28 heavy bombers gone out of over 1,200 dispatched. Barely 2.3%. A year earlier, under equal flak intensity, 10 times that number would have been lost. For pilots like Neil Carter, it was proof that survival was no longer a matter of luck alone. Escorting the bomber stream, he caught glimpses of flak bursts peppering the formations, yet saw more aircraft hold formation and push on. Later, back at Debden, he walked the flight line and saw the scars. Cockpit glass starred by cannon fire but intact, control cables patched but unbroken, engines limping but alive. The math was working. Even Eisenhower acknowledged it. In his post-war reflections, he admitted that air superiority over Normandy would not have been possible without the reduced loss rates. Without acceptable survival in the bomber force, we could not have launched the invasion, he wrote. In other words, without Wald's statistical clarity and the Mustangs that embodied it, D-Day may have been delayed or even imperiled. What had begun as a chalkboard insight in a dim Columbia University apartment had become the scaffolding for one of history's most decisive invasions. By late summer 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer win. Every engagement over Germany bled its pilots and machines. For every American bomber lost, more German fighters failed to return. And the P-51 Mustang was at the center of the slaughter. Wald's invisible hand was felt in every sortie. Bombers that once fell in flames now limped home. Mustangs that once spiraled down after engine hits now coaxed their wounded machines across the channel, and every survivor was proof that mathematics, not instinct, had tilted the balance. German commanders saw it firsthand. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's ace-turned-general, wrote bitterly, "The Americans suddenly became harder to kill. Shots that once destroyed a fortress or Mustang merely wounded it. Our pilots complained they emptied their guns to no effect. Armor had made the Americans ghosts in the sky. The Germans adapted. Orders went out to concentrate fire on engines at all costs, diving head-on into bomber formations despite the withering crossfire. It was suicide work. Angles that gave a chance at crippling a bomber also meant flying through streams of .50 caliber fire from dozens of guns. German losses spiked. Pilots who once believed themselves untouchable now faced escorts that hunted them relentlessly and bombers that simply refused to die. For the Allies, It was the tipping point. Crews who had once counted survival in terms of luck and prayer now counted it in probability. The numbers were no longer stacked against them. As General Curtis LeMay would later write, "Wald taught us to look for what wasn't there. That lesson won us the skies." The air war had reached its crescendo, and the mathematics of absence had become as lethal as any bullet. When the war finally pushed into 1945, the numbers told a story as clearly as bullet holes ever had. Losses had dropped, mission completion soared, and entire bomber groups returned from raids that once would have shredded them to pieces. Post-war analysis made it undeniable. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey documented over 45,000 returning sorties. Patterns were always the same: heavy hits on wings and fuselages, minimal on engines and cockpits. Exactly the survivor's map Wald had identified, and the wrecks scattered across German fields confirmed the missing half of the picture: charred remains with engines torn out, cockpits obliterated, control systems severed. To the men who flew, the shift was personal. Lieutenant Richard Cole, who had once flown with Jimmy Doolittle on the Tokyo raid, said after 26 missions in a modified B-17, "I saw birds identical to mine go down from engine hits. The only difference was mine had armor. That's why I walked away." Radio operator Anthony Picardi recalled a shell that should have killed him outright. Took a 20mm cannon shell to the cockpit. Plexiglass blew in. The armor plate stopped it cold. Our pilot just got a scratch. Before, that would have been 2 dead men and a lost bomber. And in the Mustang community, the same quiet gratitude spread. Pilots who once accepted that a single cannon strike to their fragile Merlin engine spelled death began writing home about lucky armor plates that let them coax crippled fighters home. What seemed like luck was, in truth, mathematics at work. Survivorship bias, a phrase Wald himself had coined in those tense meetings, had become more than a mathematical curiosity. It was now a doctrine, saving lives across the sky. When peace finally came, Wald's fingerprints were everywhere. Survivorship bias was no longer a hidden trick of the war. It became a fundamental principle of analysis. The Navy retrofitted its ships with the same logic, studying where vessels sank instead of where they survived hits. The Marines applied it to battlefield medicine, realizing they only saw the wounds that men lived long enough to carry into aid stations. Even economists and financiers began to borrow the insight. Don't just count the winners, ask what killed the losers. In military circles, Wald's name became a quiet legend. General Henry Hap Arnold wrote in 1945, "Your mathematical insight has saved countless American lives. The nation is in your debt." Eisenhower himself acknowledged that air superiority at Normandy would have been impossible without the survival rates Wald's armor adjustments allowed. But the man who had taught the Allies to see the unseen never lived to see his legacy fully unfold. On December 13, 1950, Wald boarded an Air India DC-3 for a lecture tour in India with his wife. The aircraft struck the Nilgiri Mountains and went down. The irony was cruel. The man who had saved so many aircraft crews perished in a crash of his own. He was just 48 years old. At Columbia, colleagues wept. Frederick Mosteller, later president of the American Statistical Association, said at Wald's memorial, "He saw what others could not, the ghosts in the data, the missing pieces that told the real story. He saved more lives with mathematics than most generals save with armies." And for the airmen, the gratitude never faded. In 1985, the 8th Air Force erected a plaque in his honor. It reads simply, "To the mathematician who saw the unseen and saved the unreturned." Today, Abraham Wald's insight is taught in classrooms, whispered in boardrooms, and printed in textbooks far beyond military history. Survivorship bias explains why copying successful companies often fails. You never see the graveyard of failed ones. It explains why medical treatments sometimes look better than they are, because only patients who survive long enough to finish them are counted. And it explains why, in finance, average fund performance often looks brighter than reality, because the failures quietly vanish from the record. But for the men who flew in 1943 and 1944, it wasn't theory. It was armor around their engines, steel behind their cockpits, reinforced cables keeping their bombers level. It was the difference between a telegram home and a walk back to the barracks. The math didn't just save numbers on a page, it saved faces, voices, lives. The irony of Wald's story is that he too was a survivor. He escaped Austria just before the Holocaust consumed the Jewish mathematical community. The colleagues who didn't flee were silenced forever, their insights lost. Wald lived to change the way we see survival itself, but his own survival was a kind of bias too, a reminder that history is always tilted by those who remain to tell it. And that is the deeper lesson. Every time we look at data, at history, at success, we must ask, what am I not seeing? Who is missing from this picture? What stories ended before they could be told? The bombers that never came home, the Mustangs that went down in flames, the lives erased by silence. These were the ghosts that taught us how to protect the living. Wald's math was elegant, yes, but it was also human. He turned bullet holes into a map of survival, and in doing so, he taught us that sometimes the most important truths are found in what isn't there. So the next time you hear a story of survival, whether in war, business, or life, remember the holes that are missing. That is where the real story hides. In the end, Wald's trick wasn't really a trick at all. It was clarity. While others obsessed over what they could see, the peppered fuselages, the battered wings, he asked about what they couldn't. And in that absence, he found a truth that saved thousands. The P-51 Mustang became the poster child of that truth. Sleek, fast and deadly, yes, but also survivable in a way no escort fighter had been before. Armor shielding its most fragile points, fuel tanks and engines reinforced, the Mustang could fight, take punishment, and come home. Pilots who once resigned themselves to coin-flip odds now felt real confidence. They weren't just protecting bombers, they were living to fight another day. By the time the war ended, Wald's invisible fingerprints were everywhere. Every surviving bomber, every Mustang parked on a windswept English runway, every airman who climbed down from a scarred but flying machine owed something to a Hungarian refugee with a chalkboard. His math did more than protect metal, it preserved the human thread of the war, one mission at a time. And his lesson didn't die with the war. Survivorship bias remains a warning we ignore at our peril. Whenever we study success, whenever we marvel at survival, we must remember the unseen, the uncounted, the unreturned. The truth hides not in the stories of those who made it, but in the silence of those who didn't. That's why this story matters now, just as much as it did in 1943. Because in every field, whether war, business, or life, we are all tempted to armor where the holes appear. Wald taught us to armor where they don't, and that is the real math trick that saved lives. If this story gave you a new way of seeing the world, hit that like button. Subscribe for more hidden histories where genius meets survival. And in the comments tell us, what do you think is today's biggest case of survivorship bias? Because if Wald taught us anything, it's this. Sometimes the most important thing to notice is what isn't there.